So pleased to welcome Katherine Hill to discuss her novel, Violet Hour. The book is a love story begun with a divorce and tells the story of one family's dysfunction and unhappiness with a fresh voice. Abe and Cassandra's story would be compelling on its own, but what makes Violet Hour unique is the perspective of their daughter, Elizabeth, 18 at the time of their divorce. As Miss Hill brings their struggles to life, we can all relate to them in some way. I certainly did. Miss Hill is currently an assistant editor at Barrel House, and her work has been published in places like N+1, Book Forum, Colorado Review, and the San Francisco Chronicle. This is her debut novel. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Hill.
Thanks so much, Abby. And thank you guys for coming. It's so nice to see so many friends in the audience today and so many strangers. That's almost even better. So thank you all for coming. Especially, it's nice to have my parents here today. This is my hometown bookstore. And so it's so great to get to share this moment with them. They've supported me through this whole process and have been remarkable fans and supporters. So it's really great to have them here. So I'm just going to start at the beginning of the novel. So you don't need to know anything. Just follow along if you can. And if you have children, you might want to cover their ears at a certain point, but I leave that up to you. So. For a moment that afternoon, it was only woman and water, the bay in all its sickening glory squaring itself for a fight. The waves flexed before her, muscly and ultramarine. The wind taunted her, whapping strands of hair across her Vaselined lips, where they stuck and stuck again, no matter how many times she brushed them free. Spray flew, the shoreline canted, the whole scene smacked of chaos, and above the sails, large plates of cloud shifted tectonically, exposing a lethal sun. Cassandra was no seafarer. That was Abe, who'd loved the water since childhood. They'd bought this boat because he'd always wanted one, and because she felt compelled to make concessions. It was only her second time joining him, and though the first had passed without incident, she was still in the process of gaining her sea legs. For now, they seemed to work best when they were idle. So with a gin and tonic sweating anxiously in her hand, and an invisible coating of sunblock thick as paint across her face, she reclined on the cushioned bench in the stern, her feet crossed, then uncrossed, then crossed again at the ankle. She tried to suppress her nausea, even tried to enjoy the nodding of the boat on the water, the congratulatory slapping of waves on its back. When they passed beneath the bay bridge, she looked up into its belly, where triangle trusses pointed toward land like floor lights on an airplane, illuminating the emergency exits. As long as they sailed during the day, with the shoreline always in sight, she knew she could be strong. The open sea was another story, wider and deeper than all of human civilization, with levels ever rising. There was a time when the mere proximity of the ocean had thrilled her, its color and moisture a fresh discovery, as though she were a pioneer at the end of a punishing journey over land. She used to love the way the water merged with the sky, blue asserting itself as the most dominant color in nature. It used to make her feel very powerful. Now it only made her feel frail. Of course, these days, she saw her weaknesses everywhere she went. They leapt out at her from newspaper stories of distant atrocities she'd done nothing to prevent, from the dusty, neglected corners of her studio at home. And the truth was, she was frail. Not yet in body. Her body still worked quite well. But in judgment. How else to explain Vince Hirsch, 31 and broad, if not quite handsome, a rambunctious clown in bed? She hadn't intended to sleep with him, at least not the first time. Yet through some weakness, she'd given in. Then through some other weakness, gone back for more. Even breaking it off had been a weak decision, made in fear of getting caught. He owned a fashionable gallery in Oakland, a slick place where Cassandra never felt she really belonged. But he'd chosen one of her pieces, and then he'd chosen her. She gripped the rail now as they bounced through choppy water, amazed at how life had surprised her. She'd been an adulteress, a slave to sensation. With her husband, she owned a sloop. The affair was beyond her comprehension, but she was trying her best to understand the boat. Abe's white perpendicular pet, with all its funny parts. Fair leads, halyards, jib, boom. On this late June afternoon, she wore mirrored sunglasses, a canvas hat, and a thick belted cardigan to keep her shoulders warm. In a brave attempt to relax, she left her shoes below decks. "Elizabeth," she called as they neared shore to drop anchor for a while. "Come take some more sunblock." She set her glass in a cup holder and reached for the tube in her bag. Her daughter climbed down from the prow in a bikini so red it was almost patriotic. As a child, she'd been fair like her mother, but now, at 18, she'd suddenly managed a buttery tan. Cassandra hardly recognized her. "I don't need any more," Elizabeth said, checking an arm. "Daddy's jeans have finally reported for duty." Cassandra looked at her husband, who was bronze, and always seemed to need less than she did. Less sunblock, less affirmation, less risk. He had the wheel in one hand, his gin and tonic in the other, and a volume of Voorhees waiting on the bench. He liked his drink, and occasionally his dope, but really he was addicted to reading. He spent hours at it, every night in bed, illumined by a slim, bending lamp, growing melancholy as he neared a book's end, as though some part of him were ending too. He was now almost done with the fatly collected Borges, yet this time he appeared unfazed, as though he hadn't really been reading it, only giving each page some air. Something was bothering him, something he probably had to work out for himself. She'd learned years ago not to pester him when he fell into one of his moods. "I'm not sure it works like that," Cassandra said to Elizabeth. "I think it probably has more to do with the ozone and the time of year you got your first exposure to the sun. You were in Mexico in March. Then here's my other theory, beer. I've had more beer this year than any other. I think it might have altered my body's chemistry. Maybe more susceptible to tanning." She couldn't suppress her laugh. Rational, honest Elizabeth. "That's ridiculous. It's the ozone. Mom, it was a joke." She shook her head and went off to assist with the approach. Elizabeth knew a few sailors at her school. Blonde, beach club types in polo shirts, their collars popped unnaturally towards the sky. She found them vaguely preposterous, and was likewise suspicious of sailing. "It's not about who does it now," Abe had told her. "It's about how it used to be. John Smith, Columbus, Odysseus, Noah." "So what?" she'd protested. "Everyone in history sailed, from the famous to the forgotten." Exactly, Abe told her, his point. Nevertheless, as first mate, she'd learned gamely, scrambling for the lines according to the wind, and lowering the anchor as she did now, according to her father's direction. Already she was a pro. The anchor secured, Elizabeth began to circle the deck, checking on various knots. In the welcome calm, Cassandra allowed herself the pleasure of marveling at her daughter, as adept at sailing as she seemed to be at all things. How different she was. What complete faith she had in herself. Cassandra could hardly wear a bikini when she was her age, much less buy one. Yet here was Elizabeth in magnificent tatters, apparently not even cold. She was going to college in the fall, Harvard. The word still gave Cassandra a little thrill every time she saw it printed on a piece of their mail. She'd done it. She'd given her vocationally trained parents, a Harvard-bound grandchild, the icing atop their second-generation American cake. Elizabeth's tanned legs returned now and walked up the deck. They stepped onto the port gunwale, then up to the guardrail above it, balancing precariously as if on a tightrope, and an instant later had sprung, splayed and fearless, into the bay. "Your sister's a regular circus artist," Cassandra whispered to Ferdinand, the Portuguese water dog, who had come to rest his brown head in her lap. "An artist?" Abe asked from his bench. Over the years, Cassandra's art was one of the few things that had given him hope when doctoring turned gloomy. It was incredible, the things she could make for no other reason than she wanted to. Abe was a rheumatologist, and his patients, beset with lupus, osteoporosis, and debilitating strains of arthritis, were people in great pain. They came lumbering in with walkers wide as doors, fat ankles spilling out over their shoes like muffin tops. They had hunchbacks and butterfly-shaped rashes across their cheeks, and bodies as brittle as glass. After 2 decades of approximate science, how much does it hurt on a scale of 1 to 10? Inconclusive labs. Your blood work shows no evidence of the rheumatoid factor, but of course 20% of patients never do. And infinitesimal changes in dose, yielding negligible changes in pain. He was encouraged that his wife saw a different future for their daughter. At least with art, it was possible to lose yourself in beauty, to forget for a moment that life was mostly brutal and unfair. At least with art, one did not have to look a 33-year-old mother of 4 in the eye and tell her that thanks to some inexplicable, overzealous urge of the immune system, genetic, hormonal, he couldn't say why, she had suffered irreversible damage, the cartilage having almost completely worn away, the pain destined only to increase. "I've just been thinking about Elizabeth," Cassandra told him, caressing Ferdinand's ears. "Everything keeps coming so naturally to her. She's a teenager. She ought to be tormented. But she's not. She's a regular magician. And that makes her an artist how?" Cassandra looked out over the wrinkled water, which seemed as fruitless in its journey as they sometimes were in conversation. Abe awaited his wife's response, his finger calmly marking his page. "Circus artist," she said, hearing the second time how stupid her comment had been. "Ah, because of the way she was standing on the rail," his voice trailed off. "Remember that play she did in the hall with Jessica? And those togas they had to keep gathering at their knees to keep from tripping? It was very witty." Cassandra remembered the play for other reasons, but in many ways she preferred Abe's version of the past. "She was in middle school. Can you believe that's already 5 years ago? Good God, what happened?" he asked. "How did we let her get away with this?" She laughed, and in that moment of sweet understanding, she felt she ought to tell him about Vince, that he'd forgive her and pull her to his chest as he'd so often done when they were young. If there was one thing she'd loved about their marriage back then, it was the freedom they'd felt to be honest. She could tell him when he'd been hurtful, and he would hear her and try to change. She could confess her own transgressions and be forgiven and even understood. It would take more effort to be honest with him now, and Cassandra couldn't quite bring herself to do it. She shook the ice cubes in her glass as he stood to fuss with a line. Most things about her husband now were firm. His reason, his resolve, his rules. Even at 47, his body, with its extraordinarily durable bones. He knew and sometimes overestimated his strength, imagining himself armored by his scrappy layered heritage, German Jewish, Italian, Scotch-Irish, African. Abe himself was inscrutably tan, which seemed to give him permission to disappear in any crowd. He watched the white sails ahead of them shrinking towards the bowing bridge and wondered how many outings it would take before Cassandra would be ready for the ocean. It still disappointed him that she, who'd never really lost someone, could be so frightened of the truest, greatest things. Suddenly restless, Ferdinand lifted his head from Cassandra's lap and vigorously shook himself out. He circled a few times, then went straight for Abe's leg, which he thumped against with a sigh. Cassandra clucked her tongue and retrieved an apple from the snack cooler as Elizabeth reappeared on the boat. Funny the things that bugged her. Elizabeth's tan, Ferdinand's loyalty. She felt the onset of a dangerous feeling, and biting into the apple, tried to chew the feeling away. "Hey, toss me a towel, will you?" Elizabeth stood, shivering, a weed coiled around her ankle, her bathing suit heavy and dark. She pulled the corners of her top down over her goosebumped breasts. Cassandra did, and Elizabeth cloaked herself, blotting her limbs with the seat of her suit. With a twist and a squeeze, water streamed from her hair to the deck. "How was it?" Cassandra held out Elizabeth's hooded sweatshirt. "Cold." She wrapped the towel around her waist and pulled the sweatshirt over her head, her teeth chattering in confirmation, her shoulders hunched, her face now a lavender gray. "Too cold for you, Mom, but not too cold for Dad." "It's probably too warm for Dad," Abe said, happy to extend the myth of his stoicism. Like Cassandra's effortless hair and Elizabeth's effortless grades, it was part of their sense of themselves as a family, another facet of their specialness. They would never be some great, big, powerful clan, the Rosenbergs, the Careys, the Poznansky boys who all played football. But in some ways, they were more special because they were just the three, a family rendered in its most essential, basic parts: mother, father, child. Elizabeth pulled up the anchor and joined Cassandra on the bench. She was nearing the limit of her patience with parents. "When do you think we'll head back?" she asked, once they were underway again. "An hour, maybe," Abe said. "Too pleasant to turn in just yet." Elizabeth sighed. "Not too much longer, okay? I want to meet up with some people tonight." "What people?" Cassandra always wanted to know, to imagine the scene. "The same ones who are always there. Rachel, Jessica, Brian, Henri." "Henri? Do I know him?" "He's just this diplomat kid. We've been hanging out a few months. He's friends with the guys." "That's an old-fashioned kind of name." This was Abe, from the wheel. "Whatever, so's Abraham." "But I'm a boring middle-aged dad. I'm supposed to be old-fashioned. How old is this poor Henri?" What does that matter?" Elizabeth asked, her cheeks a sudden pink. Abe's eyes met Cassandra's. He hadn't expected this. "Don't be running around with older boys, Lizzie," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "You don't want that kind of trouble." "Dad," she laughed, "I'm going to college. All the boys will be older in college." Might want to rethink that too." "Daddy, just be careful." He cleared his throat. "That's all I'm saying." Elizabeth flushed again, irritated at her father's sudden seriousness. "Of course I'm careful. I'm not an idiot. I can handle myself with anyone. Doesn't matter if he's 18 or 23. Cassandra winced. "Is that how old he is? 23? Honey." She leaned forward to look her daughter in the eye. "Are you dating this boy?" "No! I mean, not necessarily." "Christ." Abe swung the boat sharply, getting in line with the wind. "He's a really good person. His age doesn't matter." "Easy, Abe." Cassandra clutched the handrail in her hat. Elizabeth pulled her orange and white striped towel tighter around her hips. She hadn't intended for it to come out like this, if at all. But now that it had, she couldn't let them get all worked up, absurdly imagining him to be some kind of predator. "He's actually about to start a PhD in French colonial literature," she told them. "He knows people who have worked in clinics in Africa, and he knows a lot about wine, like maybe even more than you." Abe gave a humorless laugh. "Not so fast, Abe," Cassandra's stomach dropped. "You're scaring me." "Oh, for God's sake, Cassandra, it's called sailing." "You guys should meet him," Elizabeth said. They were all slantwise and speaking louder at their brisk new clip. "I'm not saying I'm going to marry him or anything, but I think you'd both really like him." She felt mature, idly talking to her parents about a man. "Elizabeth," Abe said, "I'm not making any judgments about him. I just don't want you to have any illusions. Don't be thinking you're going to lose your virginity to some romantic Frenchman." He had never mentioned her virginity before. The word on his lips was mortifying. "Well," she said, as everything flapped and the sails above them full, "that's not going to happen." It wasn't going to happen because it had already happened at a party the previous fall. Zach Lando, white wrapper, baggy shorts, large nipples, flat on her back on a blanket in the woods, dead beetles crunching dirt underneath. Afterward, they smoked a joint, and she pretended nothing had hurt. "You'll hate me in a few days," he'd said. He was right. Good, Abe said, feeling me even more unsettled than before. Cassandra had grown silent. Her daughter was having sex. There was a moment in the recent past when it had begun, and somehow in her selfishness, she'd looked away and missed it. She reached for Elizabeth's hand. You're being safe, of course. Mom, Elizabeth cried. Of course. Abe's brow grew moist and hot. His lip twitched, and he suddenly felt he couldn't control the muscles of his face. His glass was already empty, his throat constricted and dry. They were all crowded so close to one another, and he needed something to drink. He left the wheel with Elizabeth and went below to the galley. Over the aluminum sink, he measured out a generous portion of gin, adding ice and only a splash of tonic. He sipped, allowing it to burn slowly down his throat. Through the portal, he could see Elizabeth at the wheel, a sweatshirt with 2 legs, her towel having dropped to the deck. Cassandra stood beside her, an arm around their daughter's waist. She leaned in and whispered something in Elizabeth's ear. They laughed, like schoolgirls conspiring. His beautiful redheads. He remembered a time when he thought it dangerous to have a wife this beautiful. Like opening your wallet on the street, you were just asking for someone to rob you. In the old days, when he took her to bed at the end of a long day apart, he was reckless, sometimes tearing buttons from her shirts. If he wanted her so badly, he could only imagine how other men felt, who couldn't have her at all. This was the last of the gin, and still, he needed more. He had not yet begun to feel light. Cass, he called from the hatch, where's the wine? He shuddered again, thinking of Elizabeth's Frenchman. Just have some gin. None left. What? Her voice was small and resonant, as though she were speaking from inside a tunnel. None left, he stepped up for her to hear. None? Abe, I was saving that. She came toward him tentatively, bracing herself on the rails. Then don't tell me to drink it. He held up the empty bottle for her to see. Where'd it go? The wind rushed past her ears, whipping her hair into her mouth, forcing her to continue shouting, though she was now face to face with him at the hatch. I think we drank it, he said, growing impatient with her refusal to comprehend. But it was half full. God, are you really such a pig? She was teasing, and didn't mean the word in anger, but her body, which had betrayed her before, betrayed her yet again. With the gin and the wind, and the faintest hint of seasickness rising, Cassandra's mouth had been growing drier and phlegmier all day, and though she had not quite realized it before, it became apparent to them both in that moment, when on the sharp, punchy syllable, pig, she accidentally spat in his face. Well, he said, wiping the bubbles of saliva from his cheek, even as they evaporated. Oh, Jesus, she touched his shoulder. I'm sorry. Cassandra was expert at apologies. They often leapt off her tongue before she fully knew what she'd done wrong. Well, he said again, more acutely this time, suddenly aware of everything. Why don't you just go fuck Vincent Hirsch? She was stunned. Who? She asked instinctively, withdrawing her hand, hoping she'd somehow misheard. The wind slowed, and Abe found himself wanting to strangle her. She'd been sleeping with the kid. He'd known this, he realized, for weeks. The way he'd singled her out at the opening, how happy she'd been. He'd had all the clues, yet remained somehow stumped, like a foggy-brained Scrabble player, unable to unscramble his letters. He'd kept himself in the fog, making non-words, not wanting to believe her betrayal. But with the spit, it was as though the fog had lifted, and the tiles finally clicked into place. He felt he could squeeze her throat until her face turned blue. Don't deny it, he said. I know. Her eyes watered. She was guilty. She couldn't have looked guiltier if he'd caught the two of them in bed. Abe, I didn't... Jesus Christ, Cassandra, I know you did. Listen, Abe. No, you listen, he roared. Fuck you. Really, Cassandra, fuck you. Daddy! Elizabeth reproved him, her voice breaking in panic. A moment ago, she hadn't known a thing, and now she knew too much, as though she'd grown up in a matter of seconds. She wanted to rewind, to stuff all she'd learned back in its bottle, and toss it overboard and never have to see it again. She wanted that, but she knew it was impossible. Her father had unleashed the fuck. For her family, saying fuck was less like opening a bottle than like turning on a broken faucet. The fucks would continue to pour out, limitless, insensible to the damage they caused. No, fuck you, Cassandra cried, suddenly enraged. Fuck you for always making me feel like shit. Worse things were said. Things that might have been funny in another situation, but in this moment meant the end of the world. Abe was dead inside. Cassandra was an unrepentant whore. They hated each other and pronounced it with glee. They flung their words violently, ungrammatically. They scrunched their faces like babies, tears spilling down their noses and cheeks, their voices oscillating wildly, covering every decibel of rage. Elizabeth stood, clutching the wheel, watching her parents completely break down. They'd been known to shout, but this was worse than any shouting they'd ever done before. This was practically unrealistic. People wouldn't believe it had happened this way if she tried to tell the story later. They'd say she had forgotten something, left a crucial detail out. Perhaps they'd be right. Perhaps she would. Perhaps she was already erasing it as it occurred, saying no to a life of hysteria, turning their insanity away at the door. Fuck, 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 fuck. Was she even there? Could they even see her? Elizabeth steered deaf through the tempest, heading for the marina as if for safety, as if she believed their fury, like a fish, couldn't survive on land. And then, suddenly, her mother was sitting, gripping the bench with her fingertips, and her father was standing, purposefully, on the very edge of the starboard gunwale. They were silent under the noise of the wind, and then her mother stood and started to say something, and her father turned his back and dove. His body was in the air for an instant over the water, and then, as if by some camera trick, there was nothing but water and air. They rushed to the sides, looking everywhere, until a moment later he surfaced, already behind them, his head bobbing up and down in the waves, his arms stretching in sequence, one after the other, pulling for the shore. "Stop the boat!" her mother cried. "Turn it around!" Elizabeth ran back to the wheel. The wind seemed to be coming from all directions. She didn't know which way to turn. "I have to think!" she yelled. "I've never done this alone." She looked at the horizon and at the other boats for help. Ferdinand was barking at the water on the side where her dad had jumped, and her mother continued to shout at her, or maybe at her dad, though he wasn't responding in any case. He was swimming away from them and making it look ordinary, growing smaller and smaller against the rumpled sheet of blue. Which left her mother, barefoot and stricken, on the deck, and herself, a sudden grown-up, in charge of getting them home. A moment passed. Maybe a year. Maybe she'd already graduated from Harvard, and these weren't her parents at all. Remembering the motor, she turned it on, and the horizon steadied itself into recognizable layers of sky, land, and water. There. Something to hold on to. She clung with every particle of her eye. In her ears was an awful empty sound where the wind had been. Even Ferdinand no longer barked. "I'm sorry, sweetie," Cassandra said finally, having come to stand by her side. "It's okay," Elizabeth told her, because it wasn't worth it to say much else. "Do you think Dad's going to swim the whole way?" "He'll make it." "Are you sure?" "He's an excellent swimmer." "Then I guess we ought to head back." "Yes," Cassandra said. "Thank you. I love you." "Sure, Mom. I love you too." In the bay, Abe swam full on towards the trees. He wasn't far from the coast, a mile maybe, no more. There were small sharks in these waters. He'd seen them when they surfaced, but he didn't care. They could eat his legs if they wanted. In his rage, he'd outswim them anyway. With each stroke, he felt he was shedding an atom of his accumulated anger, replacing it with an icy atom of the sea. He breathed in brine. It seeped through his pores. His eyes became silty pebbles. Bay grass overtook the straining bands of muscle in his arms. His heart became the heart of a halibut, flattened, bottom-dwelling, varying its color and vibration with the earth. When he washed up on the marshy shore ages later, Abe crawled insensibly to higher ground and slept, his cheek in the mud, sludge filling his ear. A salt marsh harvest mouse and a pair of brown pelicans looked on, a tuft of glasswort in the mouse's paw, the pelicans' mouths open wide and empty. Endangered species, too, they were no strangers to a sea change. They stood crouched on opposite sides of the shivering man, as if wondering what he was. Beads of water clung to his surface, and the grass around him shifted while the pelicans regarded each other with elongated beaks. After a space of time, they seemed to reach an agreement and scuttled off. The mouse remained a moment longer, chewing on the last of its glasswort. When he was done, he sniffed the man once more, in case he harbored some morsel of food. Finding nothing, he made for the water. A third pelican was not far behind, taking flight in preparation for a dive. Thank you. So the question was, where in my process did the title come? I didn't have a title the whole time I was writing for the first probably 6 years. And then at some point I had to submit it for something, and so I had to call it something. And actually, the truth is my husband and I were tossing around ideas, and it came up that somehow he had never read The Wasteland, which I thought was really shameful. And I sort of wondered how we had made it this far. But so we sat down. I think it was his birthday or something. It was a really cheesy, I'm sorry. Sorry, honey. So we read The Wasteland aloud, and as we were going through, we were like, hey, there are a lot of novels that take their title from this poem. The Grass is Singing by Doris Lessing, A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh. And I was like, wouldn't it be great if a title just came out of this poem and would work? And then we got to it I think it's the Unreal City section. I can't remember the actual, it's part 3. And it's The Violet Hour, which is basically sunset. And the line goes, at the violet hour, when the hands and back turn upward from the desk. I can't remember the rest of it. It's embarrassing. The human engine waits like a taxi throbbing waiting. And so I loved two things about that. I loved the idea of the end of the day when you step back from all the things that you've had to do all day, and you can reflect back on what the day has been, both metaphorically, the actual day, and I think, literally the actual day, and metaphorically, your life. But I also love the idea of the human engine throbbing and waiting. I thought those were such great opposites, and I think this book is very much about the human engine, 3 human engines who are very, very much throbbing. So I liked that a lot, and I thought this will totally work for this book, since there's a lot about sunsets in it. So that's the long answer. Hi. Thanks.
I was wondering where the initial inspiration for this novel came from.
The initial inspiration. Well, again, so when you work on something for a really long time, the roots are really far back. And so for me, actually, I think this goes all the way back to college. As a senior, I took a seminar called Doomed Love in the Western World, which was an excuse to read a lot of really great, classic novels in many languages. We read them all in translation. But we read Anna Karenina, we read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, we read Madame Bovary, we read The House of Mirth. And it was a fabulous class. It was great thinking about all the ways in which social mores have affected individuals' search for love, and the sort of confusing things that we call love that may not actually be love. And so when I set out to write a book of my own, I kind of wanted to write a doomed love story for the modern era, which is a challenge because, of course, no one's going to put an A on you, if you have an affair and make you walk around in your village, as the adulteress. And you're allowed to get divorced if your marriage isn't working out. So how do you write a story that speaks to a current culture that is essentially still about doomed love? So that was my challenge here. The image of the 3 of them on the boat was the first thing that launched this book, because I really liked the idea of putting 3 characters in a totally impossible situation, like the most extreme possible situation, given their relationships to each other, and then to kind of write my way out of it. So that was how it started. Hi. It's my mother-in-law. Sorry.
Just making it possible for everybody to ask questions.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about the names of the characters, major characters and minor characters, and where they came from and how they fit into their names, or if their names came first?
Sure. Some of them changed in the process. Some of them were that from the beginning. Let's see. Cassandra was probably the most significant name. Cassandra in mythology is the prophet who no one listens to. And I sort of feel like she's her own prophet she's not listening to in this book. And so I liked that. I liked that she had this very sort of dramatic, stagey name, and she's named by these very practical people. Her parents, Eunice and Howard, are these very, they run a funeral home. They're very proper. They basically follow the rules, but they kind of broke the rules with their first daughter, naming her Cassandra. Then they named their son Howie Jr. and their daughter Mary. So they went back to a more traditional naming pattern. So I liked that. Abe, I have no idea. I love the name Abe. I've always liked it. Abe Lincoln. I just had to, it just stuck with me. And then other characters. Well, the last name, Cassandra's last name before she marries Abe is Fabricant, which is a very odd German name. A guy in college had that name, and I always thought it was so weird and cool, and I filed that away. And I think it works really well for a funeral home running family to be they make fabricants. That's what they do. They make fake people every day for funerals. So that was key. And then Green, I just love color names. So that's their last name, Green, which has a lot of resonances, I think, about, money and the environment and many other things. So hopefully you can read more into it yourselves. But those were things that mattered to me. So. Hey, how are you?
So I'm always really curious about process, sort of the writing process. So if you could talk a little bit about whether you had an idea of whether you wanted to sort of write it from start to finish, or whether you sort of found yourself writing different pieces at different times.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear about that. And then the second thing is whether you had a really strict routine that you forced yourself to follow.
Good question. The goal is always to write from start to finish, I think, because that's logical. You'll get, you know that there's always a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you can keep that in mind. So that was my goal. It's basically what I did. for the first draft. But again, that draft took so long, and I think partly because I was committed to writing from start to finish. When I revised, of course, I was writing chunks, various sections that needed attention, all out of order. And the book is told out of order in terms of the times in which these things happened. There's a lot of flashback and flash forward. So given the structure, that actually wasn't a huge problem for me. But yeah, I think the goal is to get a draft out first and then see what you have and kind of work within it. As far as my regiment, I firmly believe in giving yourself the time you need to write. And I believe that because I am not someone who can write every day. I don't wake up every morning at 7 with my cup of coffee and write, 3,500 words like apparently some professors do, as I've been reading in the news this week, which shocks me. So some people can do it, and more power to them. But for me, I need like a lot of headspace, and I need to force myself to sit down to do it occasionally. But I also need to know that I'm not on deadline, that I can have the freedom. So what I did was I worked part-time pretty much the entire time I was writing this book. So I had 2 days where I just worked on the book, or failed to work on the book, as the case may be, and then 3 days a week where I went to my job and earned enough money so that I could work on the book again the next week. So that's the basic answer there. And I think it's a hard thing to sit down alone at a desk and work on something that nobody cares about except you, really. I mean, some people care, but no one's expecting it. So you have to make the space. I think that's the takeaway, if there is one. Yeah. Thanks. Hello. No.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm interested to know where or who you are in the book and what you learned about yourself through the characters and through what you wrote.
$1 million question. So for this, I refer to Zadie Smith, who knows much more than me about writing. She's written many more books, but I think she's right about this. It rang true. She did a Twitter chat a few weeks ago, and someone asked her the same question. And she said, everyone wants to say it's all from the world and your imagination, but the truth is every character and the book is probably me, the author, split into 1 million pieces. I think that's definitely the truest thing. I mean, I thought of everything, so somewhere it comes from me, right? Nobody is modeled after a particular person, really, but there are plenty of real people in the world who might recognize things in this book, as with any book. So that's the answer there. And I also think that the what's nice about writing fiction is that it's an opportunity to kind of try out what ifs and alternate realities. So all of the characters are kind of me if I were born in a different place, in a different time, in a different body. So that's the fun of it, really, is like imagining myself as a middle-aged man and writing his perspective, who sails and smokes weed every day. Like, it's not my life, but it's fun. It's fun to imagine that life. So, yeah.
And what did you learn about yourself?
Oh yeah, what did I learn about myself? I don't know. That's great. I'm still learning. That's a great question. I don't know. Yeah. All right. Hello.
Hello, Miss Hill. So I noticed lots of wonderful figurative language and beautiful description, and I feel like you did a great job of sort of having a lot of that, but not allowing it to take over from the importance of what's actually happening. Was that, how much of a conscious effort was that? Like, were you thinking, okay, I want to really make sure to use like a cool metaphor in this scene, and or did you find yourself having to like consciously scale it back to get out of the way of the plot?
Yeah, good question. I think if you ask any of my teachers or people who read it early on, they would say I had to scale back. I definitely in first drafts have a tendency to overwrite, which is like so embarrassing, some of the ridiculously non-poetic images that I come up with. So editing is it's a relief to me because it's a chance to kind of, cut down to the best images and the best descriptions. I do favor simple writing. I think my favorite writers tend to get things right in these little gemstone kind of ways, and so I want to emulate that for sure. As far as the metaphors, occasionally, sometimes I'll be out in the world and something will strike me. This is just like this, and that will strike me, and I'll like write it down, and I'll hope I can use it. And then it's always really fun when you can go back to the grab bag and like, yes, for this scene, that moment works perfectly. So that definitely happens, because I'm also a fan of lovely images, obviously. So.
Hi, I've never met you before, but I have a question.
Hello, stranger.
So you've talked a lot about process and about characters and plot, and you started with everyone on a boat and tried to figure your way out. I'm just wondering if through your self-revision process or others revising your work, if there were any major or unexpected changes that you had to make, either to the order. I know you've talked a little bit about kind of the chapters or the plot and how it moves around, that you really just became kind of painful to move around because you had one idea in your head and it ended up, for whatever reason, having to change into some other order, some other character development.
Yeah. Well, so the first draft was like not even a full draft. It was about 4 chapters. I started it in grad school and I worked on it with one teacher. And then the next semester, the way it worked at Bennington was we had a second teacher who would, read everything you'd worked on and, start to be the new advisor. And I remember a very painful phone call with her that summer where she said, "You're just going to have to start over." I was like, "Oh, are you sure? Like not like maybe from like chapter 3 I could start?" No, you just have to start over. And there are at least a couple characters who got killed, which thank God, those guys were not worth the time. So every cut that was made, however painful it was, totally made the book better, and I'm really grateful for it. I would hate to have subjected you guys to some of those people and some of those scenes because they were not, they weren't that interesting. So there's, there were tears and there were frustrations, but I think in the end, I'm like so happy with how it turned out. So yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.